My presentation today is entitled Russia, a Friend to the Philippines. Please. What compelled me to deliver is a few days ago or last week, Philippine Coast Guard Commodore J. Tariela issued a statement where he was discussing, the various South China Sea developments. But then he added Russia into the picture. He says here, quote, without such exposure, he's referring to what was discussed earlier, the maritime assertive transparency of the U.S. ex-Navy Colonel Raymond Powell, the Project Mushu. Without such exposure, smaller nations like the Philippines will continue to be targets of so-called bullying by more powerful and larger countries like China. If we do not expose their illegal actions, countries like China and Russia will become increasingly emboldened to, quote, bully smaller nations, knowing that they will face no consequences or accountability. Their unlawful actions will go unpunished if like-minded states that support there's this phrase again, the international rules-based order remain unaware, end quote. There are three things to note here. First, does the Russian embassy in the Philippines know that they are now considered an enemy by seemingly the Philippine government because of this official? Last I checked, he is not the architect of Philippine foreign policy, but the president. This is way out of line. Second thing is, I would understand if he talked about bigger nations bullying smaller nations, and he mentioned the two countries. But the problem here is that he omitted, in the minds of the global South, people of the global South, who the real bullies are. That is the United States of America and Israel. Those are the countries which the global South and Asia view as a powerful country bullying smaller countries, namely Palestine, and now with the new Yemen issue. It's understandable that he would bring up China because, China is a claimant state in the South China Sea, particularly the Spratlys, as well as Vietnam and Malaysia and Taiwan. However, what is the purpose of antagonizing Russia other than to get support or please the Americans? Then he talks about the international rules-based order. Yet you fail to mention the United States and Israel. The United States, who lied about weapons of mass destruction to go to war in Iraq, killing millions, bombing the Middle East for 30 years without international support, bypassing the United Nations, as well as Israel, who is the most condemned country in the United Nations. Most of the United Nations General Assembly resolutions single out or condemn Israel. Yet those two countries are not mentioned in his description of bigger, powerful and larger countries bullying smaller countries. Next slide, please. Now, here are some questions I'd like to ask. This is from Commodore Tariela's LinkedIn page. He says here, quote, I am incredibly grateful to the East-West Center for granting me the opportunity to pursue my U.S.-Philippines Alliance Fellowship. Even though I will only have a 2-week window to conduct my research, this is a remarkable chance for me to connect with key government officials and policy experts in Washington who are ardent supporters of the Philippines Government Transparency Initiative, the Project Mushu, which is an American project pursuing American interests and not Philippine interests. To borrow a phrase from Senator Amy Marcos, Raymond Powell is a threatening foreign meddler who has no place in our country and he should leave. The United States is not a claimant state in the Spratlys, in the South China Sea. They have no business intervening in in a dispute which Asians can resolve amongst themselves. Now, the East-West Center, from where Commodore Tariela got his conducted his 2-week research, received from, according to this report, in 2005, received a total of 37 million, including $19 million from the U.S. Congress. The U.S. government is funding this center, this school, or place of learning where he participated in. Okay. Now, this is also the same Commodore Tariela who has called people who have expressed a different view, the non-pro-American view of the South China Sea dispute, as traitors. We have free speech in this country. We can disagree with the government's domestic policy as well as their foreign policy, and they should not be subjected to a witch hunt. They should not be really bullied or intimidated by this person who is usurping his authority. Every time I see this person in the media, he's always referred to as Philippine Coast Guard spokesperson. But he is not the overall spokesperson of the Coast Guard. He is only a spokesperson of the National Task Force for West Philippine Sea, interagency, not the entire Coast Guard. But he is represented by the media as the final voice. And this is a big mistake, because with statements like these, antagonizing Russia, going after dissent or disagreement over the South China Sea dispute, you are, as Ambassador Tiglao said, you are turning the Coast Guard into a laughing stock. Next slide, please. Right. As I mentioned earlier, the real bully, and if we want to be fair, let's include them. Let's not just single them out. The Israel and the United States. So far, 28,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. 12,000 children have been killed. Yet no mention from Commodore Tariela about this country, being a larger and powerful country bullying smaller countries. Again, the United States in this United Nations Security Council was the only permanent member. If you're not aware, the United Nations Security Council is the only body in the United Nations where votes are really binding and matter. In the U.S. Security Council, the U.S. was the only permanent member to vote against a ceasefire. Stop the killing, stop the bombs, stop the deaths. This continues to go on. Those are the latest numbers. 28,000 Palestinians are killed in Gaza. And as Kaado mentioned earlier, this column from Ricardo Saludo, Israel's bombing refugee centers. Gaza is a nation. Gaza has 2 million children living there. 2 million people living there. Half of them children. 1 million people have fled, and they're bombing. Israel is bombing the safe havens, supposedly. This is not. It's not an example that you thought was worthy to mention of a powerful, larger country bullying a smaller country, Palestine. Next slide, please. Even in the United States, there are senators who are criticizing the fact that the Americans, the United States, are the ones funding and arming, enabling and supporting this genocide, this murder of innocent civilians and children in Palestine. This is an example of a powerful, larger country bullying a smaller country. And back in December, at the end of the year, the United States of America approves emergency sale of weapons to Israel, bypassing Congress, to kill more Palestinian children. It's this, I hate to keep repeating myself, but this is a sin of omission to not mention these two countries when you're talking about bullies. Next slide, please. Is this an example of a country following the so-called rules-based international order? I have a list here of US interventions since World War II. Bomb attacks, sabotage, and removal of democratically elected governments. For the only reason that they've disobeyed the United States' demands. The Philippines is also there. It should be 1986, counting the EDSA one, but Here's the list. And I'd like to quote former President, US President Jimmy Carter. Oh, there. Philippines, 1989. Former US President Jimmy Carter says, quote, "We're supposed to be a Christian nation, are we not? But we are known throughout the world as the most warlike country on earth. And I would say almost all the wars in which we've been involved have been unnecessary." Even President Trump, Donald Trump, said they wasted $6 trillion on nothing in the Middle East for fake weapons of mass destruction. And that created ISIS and terrorism, which we experience here in Marawi, in Mindanao. So who's really the bully here, and who's really not following the international rules-based order? Next slide, please. All right. So the title of my presentation is that I'm trying to demonstrate how Russia is a friend to the Philippines, and what is our national interest. According to Pulse Asia surveys, 70 to 80% of the Filipino people, they say that inflation and high price of goods, electricity, oil prices are the most urgent problem in this country. We see this last week, a few days ago, endless oil price hikes. The price of gas is going up, 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 with no end in sight. So how can this urgent problem that the Filipinos are actually experiencing be remedied and solved through a more closer and strategic partnership with Russia? Next slide, please. After the elections in May 2022, when President-elect Bongbong Marcos won the election, he met with the Russian ambassador, Marat Pavlov, and he said Russia is ready to help the Philippines on their energy needs. June 13, 2022, His Excellency Marat Pavlov, Russian ambassador to the Philippines, said, quote, "In this turbulent period, Russia is ready to cooperate with the Philippines under the Marcos presidency and to extend help to the Filipino people's needs for affordable energy. We agree to continue our discussion further." I've even heard some discussions that Russia is willing to offer 20%, 30% discount for gas. Now, if we have cheaper gas, that would mean lower transportation costs. That would mean lower prices for goods. Everything. It all trickles down. The low price of gas, everything, all the prices of goods will collapse as well. Next slide, please. Now, it has been 400, almost 500 days since this statement from President Marcos Jr., September 24, 2022, more than a year already, where he said, quote, "We need to approach Russia. They can provide us with some fuel. We need to find those new sources of fuel, feed, fertilizer that are just critical for us." And he was asked, by the way, this interview was on American soil by Bloomberg. And he was asked by the interviewer, what about the sanctions, the American sanctions, as a result of the war in Ukraine? Sanctions are a ban or a penalty on nations. If you do business with this country or this individual, you get punished or you get fined, etc. Or you're not allowed to travel to this country or that country. So President Marcos was asked about the sanctions of the United States. Will we get punished if we buy this cheap oil from Russia? He said, the political side has been tricky, but nonetheless, national interest comes first. Who is Commodore J. Tariel to speak for national interests and antagonize Russia when his boss, the commander-in-chief, is being a friend to Russia and Russia is being a friend to us? Whose interest do you really serve? Because the interest that most in the minds, the national interest of the minds of most people is to lower the price of gas. And Russia and the president want to cooperate to make that happen. And you're over here, Commodore Tariela, sabotaging that and antagonizing Russia For what purpose? Please the Americans? To please Colonel Raymond Powell? Is that the reason? I'm merely asking questions here. Next slide, please. It's not just the Americans who are against this purchase of cheap Russian gas. If we buy the cheap Russian gas, we will have more supply of gas, and as a result, the price of gas will go down. It's not just the Americans who are objecting to this plan of the president and of the Republic of the Philippines to purchase cheap Russian gas for the people. The oligarchs, as mentioned earlier by Kamenton Kado, Manny Pangilinan, the main saboteur, the Salim Group, Forum Energy, majority owners are Americans, sabotage this plan, this cheap oil purchase plan. Makati on October 10, 2022, a few weeks after the president made the announcement, Makati Business Club Executive Director Francisco Makati Business Club Executive Director Francisco regardless, on Junior said the government must consider Francisco Coco Alcuas said the government must consider the long-term impact of buying Russian oil. So the oligarchs and the Americans are against the president and the Republic of the Philippines plan to buy cheap oil so that the Philippines can develop and give them a more comfortable life and ease their expenditures. Please zoom out. Yeah, so the Americans, the United States of America, March 8, 2022, they banned imports of Russian oil, liquefied natural gas, and coal. Now, I'm a Filipino. We're all Filipinos. Russia is an enemy of the Americans because of the Ukraine, war. But Russia is not my enemy. They're not the enemy of the Filipino people, and they're certainly not the enemy of this government. They are the enemy of the United States. The enemies of the United States are not necessarily and are not the enemies of the Filipino people. And last year in December, the United States imposed penalties, sanctions on more than 250 people and entities in connection with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, including people in China, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and the United States says the new sanctions penalties target individuals and entities who have furthered Russia's ability to wage war against Ukraine and are bolstering Russia's future energy production. Next slide, please. Now, the common refrain we hear from people who object to buying from the Philippines, from various politicians and the commentators, why they object to buying cheap Russian gas is because they always bring up this quote from the Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel, where he said, neutrality enables the oppressor. So the logic goes like this. If you buy cheap oil from Russia, we are giving them money, and that money that we paid for their cheap gas is funding the war in Ukraine, that we are somehow funding the deaths in Ukraine. This is the logic of these pro-American envoys, anti-Russian forces, etc. Now, for those who use the term enabler to describe the president and people like us who support this purchase of cheap Russian gas, would they also call Ukraine an enabler of Russia's war? Because even Ukraine, despite the war, they are still allowing Russian gas to flow through its territory, right? So when Commodore Tariela is saying we should support the international rules-based order, seems to me that when we're talking about the 2016 arbitration or when we're talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we're always referring to the West. We're not referring to the global South. We're not referring to the developing countries. We're always referring to the West. This kind of colonial mentality has no place in this new multipolar new world. In fact, to my right here, you will see the countries that have imposed sanctions or penalties on Russia because of the Ukraine war. Less than 16% of the world's population live in countries which have voted to issue penalties and sanctions on Russia. Less than 16%. So 84% of the people living in the world are not supporting this anti-Russia crusade in the United Nations. So what kind of international rules-based order are you talking about? Right? Next, please. Now, Our counterparts from the strat base, particularly Richard Haydarian, they like to use this leverage theory, right? They say the EDCA bases are a leverage against alleged Chinese aggression in the South China Sea and spread this. But I've never heard anyone made this point, so I'll make this point. People fear that if President Marcos and the Republic of the Philippines pursues this plan to buy cheap Russian gas, that we will be subjected to the same sanctions and penalties from the United States for doing business with Russia, commerce, buying this cheap oil. I dare, if I were in charge, if I had leadership, if I was President Marcos, I would dare the United States to threaten. If I was President Marcos, I would purchase the cheap Russian gas and then threaten the United States to terminate the EDCA bases and the Mutual Defense Treaty if they even consider sanctioning us. The Philippines is an independent, sovereign country. This is how you truly pursue an independent foreign policy. You pursue your national interests, not the national interests of the Americans. Russia is not our enemy. They are America's enemies, but not our enemy. Always remember that. That is true leverage. That's how you. This is how you pursue statecraft. The Americans threaten to sanction us because we bought cheap Russian oil to help our people and our commuters and our jeepney drivers and taxi drivers. We threaten, and we actually do terminate the EDCA bases to show that we are truly an independent nation, not a colonial subject of the United States. Next slide, please. Right. So this is an article from the American New York Times. The title is How India Profits from Its Neutrality in the Ukraine War. Right? Seaborne imports of Russian oil have increased. Indian imports of Russian oil have increased millions of barrels per day. So millions of barrels per day, as well as Russia, as well as China, Saudi Arabia. Even Saudi Arabia, who is an oil exporting country, they're importing record oil from Russia. June last year, 2023, 910,000 metric tons of oil imported. Saudi Arabia is imported from Russia. These are countries who are smart and are thinking and pursue their national interests first, and not the military objectives of the Americans. Next slide, please. Now, here's an example of a fellow Asian country who's benefiting from a strategic partnership and friendship with Russia. Here is Bangladesh. Bangladesh have agreed to use yuan, the Chinese currency, to settle their payment because Bangladesh is seeking Russia's help in building 2 nuclear power plants in collaboration with Russia's state-owned company in a $12 billion project. 90% is financed through a loan payable in 28 years, right? And last October, Bangladesh has received its first uranium shipment from Russia for its Russia-built nuclear power plant. My question to you is, how's our nuclear plant doing? Is it open? It's been built since 1970s. It was never open. We're not benefiting from this. The Americans and the oligarchs benefit from the Philippines being a stagnant country that's not developing. But look at Bangladesh. Look at some of your clothes and products that you have made in Bangladesh. When are we going to see things made in the Philippines? Right? Number one deterrent, number one reason why investors are not coming to the Philippines is because of our expensive electricity. If we pursue this nuclear energy path, we would have lower prices of electricity and more investors will come in and will become, this will generate trillions of economic benefit to the Philippines. And we can even be an oil exporting country now, no longer dependent. Next slide, please. Now, Kamentong asked me to cover this part wherein we revive the old statement of Bongbong Marcos, President Bongbong Marcos, which he seemingly has abandoned, with the announcement of the purchase of submarines, BrahMos Indian missiles, etc., for defense buildup. Um, During the administration of President Duterte, under, I believe, Defense Secretary Lorenzana, terminated, sorry, sorry, terminated during the administration of President Duterte. It terminated the 12.7 billion peso helicopter purchase in fear of Russian sanctions. In fairness, this was in fairness to President Duterte, many of his appointees and appointments sabotaged him. I do not blame this on the former president, just like how I don't blame the former president, because it was his Foreign Affairs Secretary Teddy Boy Locsin who terminated unilaterally the joint oil exploration. So I don't blame him for this. So 12.7 billion peso helicopter purchase was canceled under the Duterte administration in fear of American sanctions and penalties as a result of the Ukraine war. Slide, please. That is why I say, in fairness, this is not really a big concern for me, because the current president, President Bongbong Marcos, has said that there is no point for the Philippines to build up its armory. Helicopters, missiles, submarines are not conducive to a post-pandemic economic recovery that the president ran on, President Marcos Jr. ran on. He said in January 2023, quote, I think to an extent, the belief is that, first of all, there is no point in the Philippines building up its armory. More importantly, perhaps, is our abiding belief that the solutions are not going to be military. So I am not as concerned with the termination of the Russian helicopter deal, because that will not feed anyone. But what will feed people and will benefit people immediately, tangible, is the purchase of the cheap Russian gas, and I think that should be pursued. Next slide. Okay, so again, I'd like to always point out, since Commodore Tariela talked about the rules-based order, just like in the South China Sea, we always hear one narrative, that it is we always start from the middle of the story, right? China is building artificial islands in the South China Sea, but they never tell you that China has occupied 7 reefs in the Spratlys since 1998, and only when the Philippines ended one-on-one bilateral talks with China and pursued an illegal, null and void, non-binding arbitration case, that China built artificial islands. The same way, Russia did not invade Ukraine because one day, just like former Senator Ping Lacson says, it's just because they wanted to. No, there's a complete story to this. The Americans promised not to expand NATO. And what is NATO? NATO is this military alliance with the United States and Europe for defense. It was created to fight against the Soviet Union, the perceived communist threat. But the Soviet Union no longer exists. There's no more communist, expansion, etc. And even former US President Donald Trump has said NATO is obsolete because the Soviet Union no longer exists. And so NATO, the Americans said that they will not expand NATO, the American military alliance, to deter the Soviet Union, which is modern-day Russia. They said they would not expand NATO. And yet, in 30 years, they've expanded to 19 countries. And they've been provoking Ukraine. You see that picture, the cartoon on the right. The narrative is that Ukraine is just this helpless victim. Jack Tariela says, smaller country being bullied by the bear, the Russian country. That's not the case. They were provoked to be. Russia has been provoked by the United States through its puppet Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, and that's what led to their invasion. Of course, 2 wrongs don't make a right, but it is necessary for us to understand the complete picture of what really happened. Next slide, please. Now, why did NATO expansion lead to Russia, President Putin invading Ukraine? Because Under NATO, if one member nation is attacked, all member nations will come to their defense. Now, this is unacceptable because Russia is an adversary of the United States. And if this and look at this look at this picture here. US NATO military bases surrounding Moscow, surrounding Russia. It's like if I had an enemy, it's like if I had an enemy and then and then I befriend all of his neighbors and then I put missiles and rockets pointed at him. You know, if you enhance the security of one country, you cannot enhance the security of one country without the other country responding in proportion to. All right. And even the Pope Francis has said NATO caused Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You keep expanding into Russia's borders, putting weapons pointing directly at them. Well, Russia's going to respond. You're putting them in a defensive position. Same thing is happening in the South China Sea. Former vice presidential candidate Walden Bello said that what is driving China's behavior in the South China Sea is the fear of military encirclement, just like what you see here with Russia. Fear of US military encroachment or encirclement. That's what China fears. That's why that is what is driving their behavior in the South China Sea. Because people are acting in self-defense by what you have provoked them to do. Right? All right, next slide, please. All right, so President Marcos Jr. has a great opportunity to pursue or continue to get the cheap Russian gas from because he is neutral on the matter. He said, there is no need to take a stand. We are not involved except our nationals, our OFWs. And that's the right thing to do. That you prioritize your people first. But the dispute between two countries, thousands of miles away, is none of your business. Right? Please go back. So when President Marcos Jr. was asked whether the Philippine government supports Ukraine's peace plan, he said, that's not for us to decide. Those details are between Ukraine and Russia. They should talk it out. Again, emphasizing one-on-one bilateral negotiations. How they handle the territories is clearly between the two countries. Let us remember the disrespect by the Ukrainians. You know, the Russians and the Ukrainians have a war, but yet they want to drag the entire world seemingly. Ukraine wants to drag the entire world seemingly to support their cause, which have nothing to do with us. We didn't start the war. So the Ukrainian ambassador last year was complaining through the media that they were bothering and they kept calling Malacanang for months to discuss the war in Ukraine. I don't know. Some friend told me that every time he sees Ukrainian President Zelensky, he's seemingly always begging for more money, begging for more weapons, begging for more aid, etc. And no response for 6 months, June 2022 until January 2023, during the first few months of the Marcos administration. Remember the disrespect offered to us by Ukraine. Next slide, please. Yeah, and in fact, the DFA. Next slide, please. Yeah, in fact, the DFA, Undersecretary Soreta said last year he was objecting, or he was not happy with the way that Ukraine was handling the matter. In fact, he said, Ukraine is a country we have a good relationship with, but when matters like these are vented by representatives, it's not something we appreciate. Russia has done nothing but to befriend us and to offer a hand to help the Philippines and the people in Ukraine. I'm sorry, but last year they really disrespected us, according to the government. Next slide, please. So to end my presentation here, I just have one simple message. Fast track the purchase of cheap Russian gas, cheap Russian oil, so that we have lower gas prices for Filipinos, so we ease their expenditure prices. And I think the president still has a chance to pursue this and end this hardship of endless oil price hikes in the country, seemingly every other week. Thank you very much.